Evening, Dr.
Hi.
Good evening, Dr.
Hi.
Tharoor.
Good to see you all. Good to see you all.
Hi, Shashi. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Maya.
Hi, Shashi. How are you?
Navtej, good to see you.
Pleasure.
And young Zeeshan, who's really done a remarkable job for one so young. So he does point out, of course, that he's older than half the population of the country. So take him seriously.
That's still not saying much. So.
Oh dear. Anyway, it's wonderful. I'm delighted to be doing that. I'm really sorry that I had a prior commitment to an interview at 5:30, so I won't be able to stay for the discussion. I'll just make my launching remarks and disappear. I hope that's understood by all concerned. I know the organizers were conveyed this, right?
So it's 5:02. Yeah,
That's
so it's
too
5:02
bad.
people. So Maya, Dr. Shashi, if you say we can proceed, it's 5:02. We have promised.
All set, all set. Let's go. Absolutely on the dot.
Fantastic. So we'll keep tab on the time here. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mohit. I'm the founder of City Book Leaders, a knowledge exchange that tries to exchange knowledge based upon books, the conversations that can happen on books. Today, we are gathered here for a very interesting and insightful discussion on young scholar Zeeshan's book, which is Flying Blind. You can see the eagle in the background of Zeeshan's wardrobe as well. And this is definitely going to be a very, very interesting discussion, considering we have Mr. Tharoor, who's one of the most notable authors and the people that we know in terms of the foreign diplomacy and policy. For this erudite panel, for this discussion, we today have Maya Mirchandani with us. And before I hand over this digital platform to her, let me introduce Maya to all of you. She's a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and assistant professor of broadcast journalism and media studies at Ashoka University. For nearly 25 years, she was a practicing journalist with NDTV, reporting on Indian foreign policy, conflict, and national politics. While we were discussing about her profile a while ago, she said it would be too long and very boring. But let me tell you, this line will add to the spice of it. She has reported extensively from Kashmir, survived suicide bomb blast in Sri Lanka, civil war in Sierra Leone, and reported from New York on 9/11 and its immediate aftermath. She has many accolades to her credit. And without getting too much and the lengthy profile though that she has, I would now recommend to take us to this lovely, interesting discussion with this erudite panel that we have. Maya, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Mohit, and I appreciate your kind words. This is a wonderful panel, some old friends, some new friends, and a great book that we're going to be discussing. I was actually telling some friends earlier in the day, all of us sort of old hands on the foreign policy beat, chalo, somebody has written all that we've been gossiping about offbeat conversations for a long time. At least someone's come up with that book. And I'm sure Navtej and I will have some interesting conversations once we get into the discussion. But I'm going to actually ask Shashi to take over at this point. Shashi, you've kindly agreed to give a sort of keynote address and speak to this book. You've already given it high praise. We've seen it on the cover of the book as well. But, from your perspective, and it's a unique perspective, as somebody who's been an international diplomat, yet very committed to India's global stature in the world, now serving in the Indian Parliament, hands-on with foreign policy moves on a regular basis. Tell us how you place Zeeshan's book in the sort of plethora of writing that we see on Indian foreign policy. What really makes it different? And after that, with your comments, I'm going to take over the discussion with the writer, Zeeshan, who's with us, Prateek Kanwal of the Kautilya Institute of Public Policy, and of course, Ambassador Navtej Sarna, senior diplomat who recently retired as India's ambassador to the United States. Thank you all so much for being here. But Shashi, over to you.
Thank you, Maya. And I must say that it really is a joy to be launching Flying Blind by Mohamed Zeeshan. I actually first came across his writings as a 17-year-old blogger. Somebody had sent me some of the stuff he'd written on foreign policy, and I was very impressed by two things: the acuity of his insight and the flair for writing. That his blogs already demonstrated. And I had no idea he was only 17, but I, praised him and encouraged him to keep writing and asked him more about himself, and discovered he was this bright young student in Tamil Nadu who was unlike many people away from Delhi, genuinely involved in understanding, appreciating India's role in world affairs, in thinking about it, and in putting his ideas to paper. I must say that I had hoped that a young man like him would be an asset to our diplomacy, to our foreign service. His interest took him in a different direction. I think he has never taken or attempted to take the foreign service examinations. Instead, he has spent his time writing and analyzing India's place in the world, and that too is a valid role. Though I'm sure someone like Navtej would have been delighted to have had a person of his kind of talent to take under his wing and groom him to the kind of stardom that Navtej himself enjoyed in the foreign service in the senior ranks. I find that his understanding is remarkable. Though his actual hands-on experience was confined to a short stint in a sort of internship role at the UN mission, the Indian mission to the United Nations, his instincts are the right ones. And I think that that's something which in many ways you can't substitute for. You can have people with experience, but no good judgment. And here you have somebody whose judgment instinctively strikes me as fascinating and at the same time very solidly grounded. One of the things that that this young author has brought to all of us is a tremendous amount of homework. He really has taken the trouble to keep up with what's going on in the world. And when he writes, it is with thorough research behind him, as well as, of course, that he writes in such an engaging and interesting style makes him far more readable. Maya, you asked what other books are there? I don't think there's anything quite like this. A lot of our foreign policy books are very scholarly and somewhat turgid. This one is, I don't think it needs to yield to any scholar in terms of the depth of its research and its facts, but it is anything but turgid. It is lively. It is, if I may say so, provocative, both in some of its judgments and in the way in which they're expressed. And I would say that his insight, well captured in the book, that Indian foreign policy needs to be better organized in the service of the dreams and aspirations of the people of India, was also the central premise of my book, Pax Indica, that as a serving politician and an MP for, at that point, the ruling party, I think I was somewhat more constrained, and Zeeshan has certainly not hesitated to pull his punches in a way that perhaps I could have been accused of doing in some parts of the book, particularly in talking about the limitations of our approach. So the idea that, that India's foreign policy must meet both India's developmental aspirations and work for global good, which is the premise of my book, Pax Indica, is also the premise of Zeeshan's Flying Blind, except that he pretty much bluntly says that we haven't quite got there yet. And I think that's important to understand. He's made some unconventional analyses. He's come up with some bold and, as I said, provocative statements, but that's what makes the book so interesting and readable. I would like to see more and more young people like him thinking and speaking freely and confidently on foreign policy. And I think he set an outstanding example for those who might be interested. I mentioned the fact that he came from Tamil Nadu not by accident, because I've always felt, and something I said during my brief stint as a minister in the foreign ministry, that foreign policy is far too important an issue for the people, for the well-being of the people of India, to be confined to the chancelleries of New Delhi, the embassies and South Bloc, that we really need to take it out. I actually did put my feet where my mouth was by conducting both major lectures and active, lively, interactive discussions in places like Aligarh, like Shillong, like Cochin, trying to take foreign policy discourse out to other parts of the country. And Zeeshan, I think, is an absolutely inspiring example of somebody who shows that you don't have to be living and working in Delhi to care about India's place in the world and to understand it well. Let me go a little further into some of the points he makes. I would say that his understanding of the question of influence emerging from foreign policy is spot on. It's about the ability to shape events and wield power. But he understands that economics alone is not the answer, that economic influence doesn't guarantee other kinds of influence, pointing out, for example, that Russia is poorer than Japan, but far more influential in the world because of its military strength and its UN veto than Japan is with its development aid. Now, India has some obvious pros, including the size of the country, its vibrant democracy, the size of its economy, but it certainly needs to build much more political influence through a narrative that gives other countries a stake in our success. We seem to be doing that, I must say, at one point when India's soft power was at its peak and we had launched a very credible development assistance and development cooperation program. One can certainly challenge whether either of those today is where it should be and whether it has that sort of effect anymore. And Zeeshan is keen on us deciding whether we are going to sell ourselves to the world as a voice for democracy or global democratic power, or whether we're going to push the sort of early Nehruvian foreign policy ideals. I'm sure that's something that can be discussed by the panel after I leave you. But his argument that finding the balance between what's good for India, for others, and for the world are the fundamental questions for our foreign policy, and we need to answer them soon, I think is a very fair challenge to place before the decision makers. The South Asian subcontinent, the whole immediate neighborhood, obviously is a major priority, but equally breaking free of the shackles of our immediate neighborhood, looking east and looking west, is extremely important. One can question the wisdom of India's traditional fence sitting. Over the last generation or so, we have been very reluctant to take the kind of activist role that Nehru took in the 1950s, where India was the go-to country, whether it was Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Suez. Every crisis, everyone turned to India first to step in and diffuse it before it infected the superpowers in the Cold War. We haven't done that for a very long time now. At least the UPA government even had a special envoy for the Middle East. The BJP government has simply let the position lapse. And I don't blame them entirely because the position didn't actually get a chance to do anything at all. Here we have an Afghanistan crisis on our borders, and India is not at the table or in the room when crucial discussions are discussed and decisions made. We are not involving ourselves even in areas like Africa, where we had historically developed a good set of relationships. When it comes to wars and conflicts in Africa, India is absent except through the UN. If the UN invites us to participate in an African peacekeeping operation, we go, but we don't actually use any direct leverage for ourselves. And I think these are all questions that we've just conducted a rather modest naval exercise with 3 other countries, Australia, Japan, in particular being interesting partners in this, in the Malabar framework. And the question that comes up is, are we going to take that farther? America, Australia, Japan, and India sound like an incipient new formation. We're very careful to avoid words like alliance, so we speak of a quadrilateral dialogue. But when you've got your same ships in the water, it's surely more than a dialogue. What is it? These are things too that are probably worth discussing. We've just joined the UN Security Council as a non-permanent member. It'll be very instructive to see how we use our time over the next couple of years. In the past, we have largely played a balancing role and a slightly defensive posture. I wouldn't say we've been terribly creative in pushing any sort of agenda of our own on the Security Council. But as we know, many of the countries looking at our claims to a permanent seat one day want to see from our non-permanent performance exactly how we're likely to use that seat in terms of producing a leading role. And that's something we haven't done. So those are just some strands. I've taken a little more time than I had intended to, but I do want to quote one passage from Zeeshan that actually impressed me and that sums up, I'd say, the key thrust of it. What India needs today, he says, is to return to the more internationalist approach to foreign policy, with a willingness to once again represent and fulfill the needs and aspirations of other countries in the pursuit of global influence. It must be cognizant of what it's capable of offering to the world and what it needs the world to offer it in return. To start with, it has to find a way to articulate and sell the India story to the world. And that's where I'll end, that the India story itself is one that is changing under our present political management, under our present government, and whether the story that is emerging, that is perceived around the world, is a story that is going to be that easy to sell is another question that will need to be settled. With that, let me just say once again what a wonderful book this is. Truly enjoyed the challenge, and I do want to say to Zeeshan that I hope he will go on writing more and more on world affairs. One reads his columns. I've tweeted a lot of his columns in world media on aspects of foreign policy and international affairs. He's already one of the more exciting and readable young voices in the country, or not so young, because he reminds us that at the age of 27, he's already in the older half of the Indian population. But with all that wisdom, I think he still qualifies amongst the tribe of people who understand and write about foreign policy as one of the younger ones. And I want to congratulate him on Flying Blind, wish it all success, and hope that it's the first of very many books from his pen. Congratulations and best wishes to the author, Mohamed Zeeshan, and the book, Flying Blind. Jai Hind. Thank you very much, Maya.
Thank you so much, Shashi, for that wonderful opening address, and a lot of stuff for us to chew on in the course of this discussion. But before I open it up to the other panelists as well, I think, Zeeshan, it's really time for you to come in right now. Two things. One is, of course, what Shashi said is your idea that the India story needs to be told out there in a much more vocal, much more vociferous way. So what really is your view of the India story we need to be selling right now? That's one. But I think what I really was the most, I would say, amused and somewhat curious about was the title of your book itself. That itself is a statement. So, can you come in on both those things, and then we'll open it up for further discussion?
Certainly. Let me answer the second question first, because it is one that I actually pondered over for a long time. And to be honest, I think writing the book itself in some way was somewhat less taxing than coming up with the right title for this book. I certainly did debate and discuss a lot of the potential titles with a lot of people before settling on this. But I settled on this, even though a couple of my friends were saying, hang on, this is a bit too provocative. Are you trying to cock a snook at the establishment? I said, well, look, I mean, the premise of the book itself, or the purpose and rationale of the book itself, is to say that India is really in many ways a pretty powerful country. We are a very large country. We've got one of the largest militaries in the world. We've got one of the largest defense budgets in the world. Certainly an economy that's long been on the move, even if it suffered in recent times due to COVID and other factors. So India, I think, is in some ways a natural power on the global stage. But to me, I think the reason that India does not seem to the outside world as much of a power on the world stage as it should be is because there is a sense of lack of direction. And as a result of that, I think that there are a number of inconsistencies that have captured Indian foreign policy in the neighborhood, outside the neighborhood, at the UN, and so on. So I think in some sense, that's where the title came from. I'm saying that India is, in some sense, flying blind in the pursuit of its global aspirations, but it's still flying nonetheless, because a country as large and as consequential as India in international politics cannot crawl, it can only fly. And so long as we are able to give it some direction, I think India will be able to shape the world order in the decades to come. Your first question about the India story is one that I'm very, very passionate about, and that's why I've written an entire chapter titled that. To me, I think the India story is very obvious to most people that I talk to around the world. They talk about the fact that India's freedom struggle is a great inspiration. It's inspired Nelson Mandela, it's inspired Martin Luther King. People look up to Gandhi as one of the consequential figures in modern world history. And the fact that India was able to fight a successful non-violent movement, set up a template for several other countries around the world, several nations and people around the world, that even to this day, I think in many parts of the world, people actually do yearn to emulate what India managed to do in establishing a non-violent freedom struggle. But also what came after that to me was very important. We're speaking one day after the Republic Day, and that is very consequential because I think a lot of countries around the world did manage a freedom struggle, but a lot of countries in the post-colonial world did not manage a stable, functioning democracy the way that India did. And the reason we were able to do that was because we had a constitution that respected the multicultural identity of the Indian civilization. It was secular. It respected multiple identities and cultures. It gave space for everybody to express themselves and be equal citizens politically and economically and socially. The affirmative action programs were also one of the factors, I think, that many countries around the world have looked to see if it will succeed in pulling up marginalized sections of Indian society. So for me, all of these things together, the fact that India managed to build a sort of hodgepodge republic out of every known religion to man and hundreds of different languages and dialects, that I think makes the India story. And the fact that we've built a functioning emerging economy out of this, I think that also is the essence of the India story to me.
Right, Zeeshan, thanks very much for that. And just to sort of follow up to that, I mean, on the one hand, yes, it is the India story that has actually given us the stature we already enjoy in the world: the multiculturalism, the stable democracy, the constitution and its principles, etc. But very often you find, whether it's the political classes, whether it's even some of our diplomats, they feel hamstrung by the very things that make India great, because it becomes an impediment sometimes. As we saw when the nuclear deal was being negotiated, for example, one of the sort of most landmark events in recent Indian foreign policy, where we actually had diplomats, say that other political parties were running around like headless chickens. We won't name anybody over here, but the good things or the positives about the India story actually become impediments in the path to progress as well, or the path to diplomatic glory.
Yeah, this is absolutely right. And I think the reason for this is because India's foreign policy in some sense is flying blind. I think people understand what I mean when I say the India story, but we haven't managed to translate this into foreign policy action. We're not sure, as I say in my book, we're not sure if we should stand up for democratic ideals around the world, especially in difficult countries like the Maldives or Myanmar or other parts of the world. Should we make a statement against Bashar al-Assad when he's killing people out on the street? These sorts of things, I think, and as a result of that, we've ended up going with the sort of status quo, easier answer, which is to sit on the fence. And as a result, I think we haven't been able to translate the India story. And if we do manage to do that, I think if there is some coherent direction to what India should stand for on the world stage, you would find over a period of time that domestic politics in India and different groups and factions would also start buying into that. You see this in the US, for instance. There's obviously a difference of opinion between the Democrats and the Republicans on various issues, but they all by and large agree that America is a shining beacon of light as a democracy on the world stage, that America should speak up for the rights of different populations and nations around the world. So there's no basic struggle over these basic tenets of US foreign policy. But in India, we haven't decided as yet what those basic tenets should be.
Right, and I think that's a very important point to bring Navtej in on this. Ambassador Navtej Sarna, you've served a stellar career as an Indian diplomat. I often had the good fortune of running into you as spokesperson. I don't know if you will have the same sort of feelings about my questions at that time, but I think the point that Zeeshan is raising is really a valid one, that at the end of the day, the central tenets of Indian foreign policy, what really are they today in the climate that we inhabit? Why is it that in spite of the sort of positives, there is a sense globally that India does sit on the fence when it comes to key global developments. I mean, on the one hand, we seek the stature of a permanent seat on the UN Security Council because our population demands it, our economy demands it, etc. But that requires taking positions that may not go down very well, and that's something we're not too comfortable with.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you for making me part of this. Yes, I have great, happy memories of my tenure as the official spokesman, and all of you, my friends in the media. And it's always a pleasure to see you again. My compliments to Zeeshan for his book, very, very impressive research and book at such a young age. And as Shashi mentioned, I echo most of what he said. I think the beauty of the India story is that we have so many different views on everything. So I like Zeeshan's enthusiasm. I like his passion. The problem is that I've spent too long inside the tent, and I do have a different view on some of these things. So I think it's important to not sort of miss some of the basic things. So if you give me a couple of minutes, I'll try to get into this. Frankly, I don't think it's fair to say that we are flying blind. I think the Foreign Service Establishment of India has been a really, whether if I say it's myself, it has really been the creme de la creme of Indian bureaucracy and thinking. And I think you've had some very devoted people at the head of the Foreign Office, both at the political and the bureaucratic level. So at every stage, I think the foreign policy, first point about foreign policy reflects your domestic concerns, your domestic needs. There can be no divorce between foreign policy and your domestic standing, your domestic strength, and your domestic concerns and what you want at any. And this second point, this is not a constant. This evolves as we have gone along. What you call fence sitting it's nice to call it fence sitting, but sitting on a fence sometimes lets you see what is happening on either side of the fence. And if you're not sitting on the fence, are you behind the fence, then the other side is locked down to you. I'm saying it very simply, but in the 50s, and as a really an indigenous colonialized nation, as Zeeshan himself has pointed out, all we had was the political capital of the freedom struggle. We had the moral high ground for the others who were colonized. It would not have served our purpose at any stage to be on one side or the other side. So we took the road of non-alignment. Today also, and there are many things in the middle, but to come to the basic point that we have said that if we are seeking a global role, then we need to be taking positions, we need to be, well, frankly, we do take positions on issues very, very strongly. And I'm not talking about Maldives and Myanmar. We have been, for instance, on global issues. We have been the leaders for the developing world ever since I can remember, since my days during the Rio conference, to see on climate change, for instance. We have been one of the leaders of the developing world, and our position has nuanced and changed only a few years ago. We have been taken very strong positions, for instance, on nuclear weapons and disarmament issues. We have taken very strong positions on trade issues at the WTO. Now, what you are seeing as fence sitting on issues like Maldives and Myanmar, I would see it differently. Unlike the United States, India has never taken the position that it is going to promote democracy in other countries, or promote regime change, or define a kind of government for any other country. Our position always have been is that let that country decide its leadership and polity, and we will deal with it to the best advantage for India. Now, you may quibble with that is this the right approach? That's a separate issue. But what I'm trying to say is that this is a conscious stance. That is why, while we were supporting Aung San Suu Kyi and whatever she said, we were also dealing with the military junta there. And here it comes to, what is good for India at that stage. You might call this cynical, but then isn't anything cynical? I mean, America promotes democracy, and then it has been the closest friend of military dictators in South and Latin America for years. So where is this? So, we have to take a position. Are we going to start looking at regime change and defining what our governments are? Maybe we have changed a bit. Maybe we have started talking more in favor of democracy in other countries than we did in the past. But all I want to say is that this is not a decision by the blind. This is a conscious decision. It is dictated by years of need. It is dictated by years of what India has had to do with very, very scarce resources. You yourself put it very eloquently in your book as tightrope walking. So this has been a lot of tightrope walking on different positions. And I think the fundamental asset that it has given us in our foreign policy is flexibility. We are not locked into an alliance. We are not locked into a position. And yet it doesn't mean that we value democracy any less. But we don't say that it's, that you must also become democracy if those people have voted or want something else. If they want our support, yes, we do support those institutions. I've gone on far too long. I'll let the others come in, but I'll come back to you on these.
Before I move on to the others, Navtej, I have a follow-up question, because I see where you're coming from as a practitioner, as a diplomat who's kind of led and steered in India through some very difficult global circumstances, undoubtedly. Do you make the point about the ability to be flexible? You can, if you look at it negatively, the glass is half full and you're sitting on the fence. But if you look at it as the glass half empty, but if you look at it as the glass half full, you're actually being able to maneuver yourself in a position that suits your interests the best. But just before I go on to Prateek, for my own understanding and for that of the audience, is there a difference that you see between the non-alignment that we've sort of prided ourselves on in the early years of India as an independent country, and the kind of global stature we saw with leaders of that movement and the sort of South-South solidarity, the developing world, etc.? Do you see a difference between that non-alignment and strategic autonomy, as we like to call it today? Is it the same thing or is it different?
Well, yes and no. There is clearly a difference because the world has changed. When in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 60s basically, and up to the 70s, the non-alignment that India was one of the leaders of was dealing with other issues. It was dealing with colonialization. It was dealing with racial discrimination, apartheid, North-South issues of trade. That world has very much changed. Countries have become free, the systems have changed, the Soviet Union has gone, the blocs have gone. So in many ways, the world has changed. So yes, there was a certain irrelevance that had come into that movement, but not on the principles. The strategic autonomy, I think, is a product of not steering clear of two blocs, but for taking to advantage our relationship with major strategic partners who actually don't see eye to eye with each other. I give you the example of US and Russia. Right. Now, US and Russia have traditionally had an adversarial issue, but we want our strategic autonomy. So we have defense acquisitions from the Soviet Union and later Russia, and we are buying more and more of American weaponry. Now, that is a strategic autonomy that we need the decision-making space to do what is useful for us. You can't tell us what we should not buy. At the same time, the strategic autonomy is, Shashi mentioned the Quad, for instance. Why have we been so cautious in the Quad? Because while we would like to partner with the US in the Indo-Pacific, we have been treading cautiously because we have China, the huge China, military strong China sitting on our border. The US doesn't have it. Right. So we have, nor does Australia have it. So we have to, we have to keep our independence, our decision-making, keeping ours. So strategic autonomy, I think, is an evolution of non-aligned principles in a world of great power rivalry.
Right. So in a sense, I mean, as you said, the realities have changed, and Indian foreign policy adapts. So the adaptability is really what's at stake. Before I get into more detail on sort of the strategic versus the economic, although you can argue that economy is a strategy in today's world, I want to bring Prateek Kanwal into this. Prateek, you're heading a public policy institute where young people like Zeeshan are coming in to you know create and maybe give some kind of direction to foreign policy frameworks. But one of the things that people like you have been arguing for, we have a very small diplomatic corps given our size. I mean, our diplomats to population ratio is extremely tiny. Do you think that there is space for young people like you or Zeeshan to make lateral entries into the diplomatic space? Would diplomats like Navtej welcome something like that? We'll let Navtej come in on that later. But maybe you can answer that, and also as a sort of corollary to that, Shashi and Zeeshan also made the point about the role of Indian foreign policy in the domestic consciousness. Is it a fallacy to assume that foreign policy does not play a role in our domestic consciousness?
Maya, actually, I'll take the second part one. It's our sort of good, not a good fortune for us. It's foreign policy is so foreign in India that we don't even teach it here, right? I mean, we have to go outside to Kennedy School or to the Columbia University to actually learn it. So it's actually truly foreign in its all its elements. And I want to first compliment Zeeshan. I mean, the first conversation I had with him was exactly this point, right? If somebody is interested in foreign policy, where do they go to actually study, right? I mean, you teach at Ashoka. I'm glad they have a China center now. Once the China crisis began,
we have
yes. So imagine a country of 1.3 billion has only one university teaching foreign policy. So I started off talking to Zeeshan about how do we sort of get young people to sort of take interest in India's foreign policy, because our youth is only concerned about how China is attacking us or Pakistan is attacking us. So foreign policy in all its realm means it's national security, right? But there is trade, there is culture, which is involved, and we usually don't talk about it in the Indian context. I mean, apart from a few foreign policy think tanks in India, I mean, where are our Samantha Power, Joseph Nye, Nicholas Burns, and Ash Carters? I mean, we don't have the benefit of having those people in academia teaching in our universities, right? So how does individual in India interested in foreign policy actually learn about and sort of make a career apart from the foreign services? And I'm glad Ambassador Sarna has agreed to join us in our quest to ensure that at Kautilya, at least we can sort of set the stage right in terms of getting more and more people to take up foreign policy and encourage a lot of our faculty, Maya, you including, to sort of come and sort of build this culture wherein we can bring in more and more young professionals like Zeeshan and myself to actually take up foreign policy. So I feel we are so stuck in our domestic, troubles related to national security that we often forget that there is our other peel. It's like orange, right? I mean, there are multiple layers which are there to foreign policy, and we are not able to secularize enough foreign policy to our youth beyond the realm of national security. So I think it's imperative, as a country, that we move beyond Delhi. Like Shashi pointed out, we are based out of Hyderabad as Kautilya School of Public Policy. We have a Look East policy, which we want to focus on. We again want to bring in a lot of professionals to sort of do the Masters in Public Policy with a specialization in international affairs and global affairs. And my hope is that, people like Ambassador Sarna will guide us how young folks can play a lateral entry role into sort of helping India's quest to become global leader. So that's something which I really wanted to point out. It should be a focus of our country, our policy schools, not just the top policy schools, to sort of secularize and mainstream foreign policy into the Indian academia.
Right, Prateek, thanks very much for that. I'm going to actually take it back to Zeeshan very quickly. We have very little time left. So 5 minutes for further discussion, and I'll open it up to questions. But Zeeshan, this idea that there should be more younger professionals involved and, foreign policy. I think Prateek has made a very interesting point about the domestic consciousness, which is that the perception of foreign policy in the domestic context is specific to national security and is specific to some neighbors, and could be specific to when a world leader comes visiting India. Is there something that's happened? And now and then trust me, from somebody who's sort of tried to push stories in a newsroom on a regular basis, if it's not a world leader coming in from the United States or Russia or China or the UK, very often to even get a story onto the news bulletin would have been was a genuine struggle. So how do you break from that in your view? Because you are talking about the fact that there are many, not just soft power and culture and people to people contact, but very clearly trade and defense acquisitions are huge components, huge drivers of our relationships abroad. So how does that factor in?
No, I'm quite glad that you brought in, your perspective on pitching stories to newsroom editors and then shooting it down, because I was going to bring in everybody's favorite punching bag into this conversation, which is the media. I think that in some sense, the bulk of the blame would lie, at the feet of the media. And I write in the preface of my book about this. I said that I noticed this when I went to the US and spent a couple of years at Columbia reading the New York Times. There are pages and pages of news on other parts of the world outside the United States. There's stuff on Africa, there's stuff on Asia, there's stuff in Australia, of course, Latin America and Europe. But if you open an Indian newspaper, at most you would find probably a page and a half of news. And I'm being charitable when I say page and a half. Generally, it's about half a page of news or one full page of news. And so as a result, what happens, I think, is that most people in India do not get access, even if they do read newspapers, to stories from other parts of the world. And whatever makes it into the newspaper, as you said, is largely based on the US or the UK or really the neighborhood. The other side of this, I think, is also the sensationalism that we see in media coverage. People in newsrooms, I think a lot of editors want to pitch and publish very spicy stuff. And that means that China is coming across the border, or that Pakistani terrorists have infiltrated into India. And that's about it. I think beyond that, we do not really give much airtime or space to any story from other parts of the world. And we become preoccupied in some sense on things that, as I write in my book, I don't have a separate chapter on Pakistan, but I've given a subsection on Pakistan, and I've said that I'm writing the subsection only to say why I have not written about Pakistan in the chapter on South Asia. And I think that's because there is a lot of obsession in India on sensationalist stories that come out, which Indian foreign policy, quite frankly, cannot do anything about. And I think that's where it starts. But the other side of this also, I think, is that India has still, in my view, not a very proactive foreign policy, especially outside of South Asia. As Dr. Tharoor pointed out, we do not do anything in Africa outside of UN peacekeeping. The last time that I read a story on UN peacekeeping anywhere in the Indian media, I really cannot even remember. Yeah. And yet there are peacekeeping missions that go on every day. So India does not take a proactive stance in its foreign policy outside of the neighborhood. And so as a result, also the media coverage is in some sense jailed and arrested within the neighborhood. There's no reason for people to start reporting on what's happening in Africa or what's happening in Europe or in the Middle East. And so people in India, as a result, do not get information on which they can actually debate and discuss on a daily basis.
Yeah, so I get that it's in a sense a vicious cycle. But Navtej, come in on this because this is something that has also been a part of your experience as a diplomat, which is that when there are actually critical stories of foreign policy where there might be great advancements made, improvements in relationships, trade deals that are integral. You talked about climate change, for example, but even things like, South-South solidarity, they don't make it to the news headlines. And the perception is that unless there is some tension, some conflict, or some way of positioning India in a glorified space of first world powers and aspirational, the nitty-gritties of foreign policy sometimes just get ignored.
Very, very valid point, I think, made by Zeeshan in his book, and what you have brought out, Maya. Let me say a couple of points on this. Firstly, since he does talk of the US media and the availability of foreign news, let me tell you that before I was spokesman, and for 4 years, I was minister counselor dealing with press in Washington, D.C. So I did have an idea of what's happening in the US media. Yes, the New York Times, the Washington Post, does cover a lot of international news, but inner America knows nothing beyond the local corner, the local basketball team, the local American football star, and the local foodie joints. There is no awareness of foreign news inside America. So let's be clear. Even the CNN is divided. The CNN that you and I see here is not the CNN you see in the United States. This is CNN International for the other planet, and CNN for America is separate. So yes, they do have. Unfortunately, our media has changed over the years. I do remember that in 40 years ago, there was much more awareness about international news in media. Maybe because we were not drowned by domestic news and compulsions. Every major newspaper had international pages. And we saw much more of it even on Doordarshan. As a child, I remember seeing much more of European news than other stuff. So that, unfortunately, what you're saying today is absolutely correct. And this is something which I felt as a spokesperson, that the best of stories you couldn't get into the Indian newspapers unless they were to dealing with Pakistan and at best the United States. I mean, these were or maybe a spat with Nepal or Sri Lanka. So you missed a lot of stuff, and this leads into what Prateek has said about the domestic consciousness. This is something which the fact is, these are the realities of newspapers and TV channels, which you know better than I do. The kind of fight for space that happens. I absolutely agree, and I absolutely agree that this needs to change.
Yeah, and I mean, just to sort of bolster that, we have a comment coming in from some of our audience who is saying that, South-South cooperation, BRICS, the BRICS Development Bank, it's IBSA, for example, they make headlines. It's just that we ignore them. It's also actually the bane of a good foreign policy reporter. I mean, all of us diplomatic correspondents on the beat who would, fly all over the place just to cover these stories and find that, has our report been taken? Has it not? It's in the midnight bulletin. Who's watching it? These are realities. I mean, there is a hierarchy with which newsrooms also engage with foreign policy. But I also agree with Navtej's point about the US media. And I would, as a moment of introspection where the Indian media is, go on to say actually that you will still find newspapers giving the attention to some key foreign policy stories. I mean, it is television that has made our news consumption extremely insular. And I think that's where the tension really rises. But Navtej, quickly,
I'd just like to comment on this point and actually say knowledge drives consumption. I mean, if this was a Bollywood panel and a Bollywood star was out here, you would have probably had thousands and 5,000 people. Look at the small community of people which wants to consume this knowledge, right? So once we're able to get the knowledge out, right, it will drive consumption. We've not been able to, I think it's a very elite concept, foreign policy, and we've not been able to take it to far-flung places like Dr. Tharoor was mentioning. Once more and more people starts to have awareness and knowledge, I think consumption will also follow. I think so. It's a knowledge consumption dichotomy which we face here.
That's a fair point, but there are sort of arguments for and against. And Navtej, you can come in on two illustrations that I'd like to kind of bring to your notice, and then you come in. One is that the perception that foreign policy is elite. I mean, we talked about our global role in UN peacekeeping. The soldiers that went into these far-flung missions in the Congo, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Israel and Palestine, wherever, they were not from elite backgrounds. They were Jawans like all our Jawans are. So where is that breakdown happening? That's one. And the second, I think in today's context, a current example, and a few of our audience are asking questions around this. I mean, vaccine diplomacy, it's actually giving India a chance to position itself on the global stage as a key player in a real context. Navtej?
Absolutely. I'll come into that, Maya. carrying on where I left off, for instance, what our media misses, for instance, is what Zeeshan is saying, that we don't do anything in Africa except peacekeeping. I think this is fundamentally wrong. I was, had the privilege of dealing with the India-Africa Forum Summit for 5 years ago. And I know the kind of lines of credit, the kind of projects we have all over Africa, but we have nobody to talk about them. So this is an idea for Prateek. For instance, we had organized an Africa Editors Conference here, just so that, this media exchange takes place. We used to have PTI correspondents placed in Africa. Now, they pull them back because they say we don't have money. So there's no reporting coming out of what we are doing there. The second point you said was about the elite. I think this is a misconception which needs to go. It's a misconception about diplomats. It's a misconception about the MEA and all of us. Yes, we are a privileged position, that we are the privileged position to deal with, with the sort of decision makers of other countries if we play our cards right. If we have the access to politicians, to journalists, to artists, to everybody in that society, if we want. Second, this is not the foreign service of the 1950s. These are not people coming from Oxford and Cambridge or princely backgrounds. These are ordinary people like you and me who have come up the hard way, taken an examination and got in. And they are also now such a mixed, bright lot. There's some engineers, there are doctors, there are IT people, there are all sorts of people who have really come hard. And the lives they live are not elitist lives. They live in where they all don't live in Washington or Geneva or Paris. They're all living in very difficult circumstances, in very scarce resources, at great risk to health, family, etc. So I think let's get this elite business out of this, because elite, unfortunately, in this country is becoming a bad word. It's not a bad word. It's the elite in access, which is the only elite part that there is in this thing. Vaccine diplomacy, I think that's a very important point, and I'm so glad that the government has done what it has done of sending vaccines to these countries. This is plays to what Zeeshan is saying, that we should take an internationalist outlook, because frankly, today's is a tired world. It's a defeated world. It's a world coming out of a pandemic with millions of people have lost jobs, millions, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives. So I think foreign policy has, if it has to get a lift, it has to get a lift onto a moral high ground. This is the moment for India to grasp that moral high ground again and to go beyond transactionalism, to go beyond immediate profit. And we have to do it even if it costs us, even if we make our pharma giants say, okay, give this wretched thing free to people, but they have to do it, because you can't be internationalist and petty transactionalist at the same time. So something has to come in. So I all kudos to people, to government, for doing this vaccine diplomacy, frankly.
I think that's a very important framing that you have given actually in Navtej, because you can't be transactional and internationalist at the same time. Zeeshan, I think that also goes to the heart of what you're saying. In a sense, when you talk about South Asia, for example, and India's relationship with other South Asian countries, whether it's development, it's assistance, it's infrastructure, it's also coming from a place where we are seen as a regional hegemon, and so therefore the relationship is one of some sort of tension over there. But do you see someone like you, your book is very bold. I think it's forcing diplomats to introspect, even if they have, there are many great things about Indian foreign policy, and we've seen our diplomats actually excel on the world stage. So there's a lot to defend, but there is a time for introspection, and I think this is one such time. Do you think, for example, in this fight between transactionalism and internationalism, as Navtej frames it so beautifully, that vaccine diplomacy is going to be that one thing to take us out? Or do you still feel that public health or South-South solidarity or economics will still be secondary, as you point out in your opening chapters, to strategic health?
I agree wholeheartedly with Ambassador Sarna. I think that vaccine diplomacy, as we see it now, is one of the bright lights of Indian foreign policy. This is exactly the kind of stuff that I hope India does a lot more of and more consistently. I don't know if I have mentioned it in my book exactly, but I've written about it in the media elsewhere, that the International Solar Alliance that India led was another one such example, where India stood up for global interests and the interests of other countries, and stood for it quite in a very steadfast manner. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree that these sorts of initiatives should keep happening. But at the same time, I think that I think we need to be more careful about not getting caught on these sorts of ad hoc initiatives that take place every now and then, anytime that there is a bit of a crisis. In my book, for instance, I talk about building something called the Delhi Consensus, which is essentially to build a development platform for countries like India and countries in Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere that face a lot of the same sort of developmental challenges that we face, sort of share lessons with each other, a kind of a knowledge sharing network. Also build state institutions, particularly in fragile post-conflict states that are just coming out of a civil war. I think we need to institutionalize all of these sorts of things and not just rely on a few ad hoc initiatives here and there that I think eventually, as you said, will be forgotten, not just in the limelight in discourse here in India, but also in discourse around the world. I think that once the pandemic goes away, 2 or 3 years down the line, once again, the world, public attention around the world is very short and fickle. So we need to institutionalize this sort of stuff.
I think that's an important point, that once the pandemic is behind us, whenever that may be, hopefully in the immediate future. But where do we go from here? And we're seeing even in the issue on the issue of vaccine diplomacy, we're seeing it take place in the neighborhood. I mean, there are countries we're choosing to send vaccines to. Right at the beginning, when we announced our first lockdowns, we saw the Indian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister reach out to the neighborhood first. And I think, I'm going to conclude it with this, because I think there's a lot for everyone to chew on as far as this debate is concerned. But the sort of the pandemic, in a sense, has forced us to also go back to the drawing board on Indian foreign policy, which is the inability to travel far and wide, the inability to look at your own geographical frontiers, has made us realize that in order to be internationalist, I think we will also need to be regionalist once again. And so, that sort of coming together has to start at home before we can go out yet again. And as Navtej pointed out, I mean, we have difficult neighbors on our borders. Other countries in other global alliances don't necessarily have that. Those are India's realities. But hopefully, Zeeshan, with your book, I hope all diplomats read it, current, serving, retired, future. And I hope people like you actually do make lateral entries into the foreign service, because Navtej, bear me out on this. I mean, you do think that we could do with young blood like Zeeshan's, right, in the Indian foreign policy?
Well, I think, we do have a very short-staffed foreign ministry, and we have made attempts, we have expanded it. Where we used to take 10 or 15 people, now we take about 35. That's a long way. But we've also started taking in people as experts. The foreign ministry is taking in experts, particularly on issue-based, from other ministries, and I believe even from outside. I'm not so sure of the latest policies, but I think as foreign policy gets more complex, there is place for experts to come in as experts. And diplomats in the professional lineup to carry on with the work they do. I must say, however, that while experts would, I'm sure the Foreign Service would welcome expert opinion, I would say that there is also need for specialization within the Foreign Service. Because the technicalities of foreign policy have increased much more than in previous years. You need people who are experts on health, who are experts on environment, who are experts on trade. So so everything has to come together to get a group of people befitting a large country like ours.
Right. And I think, Zeeshan, that's a perfect place for you to kind of also make your pitch with the foreign ministry as well. I really hope that we see more people like you, spreading the India story, a cohesive India story, hopefully, far and wide. Thank you all very much. This has been an excellent panel, a lively discussion. We've run out of time, but I hope you all go out and buy Zeeshan's book, read Zeeshan's book, learn from it, and pass on what you do from there as well. Zeeshan, thank you very much. Congratulations once again on this fabulous new book.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Maya, thanks, Ambassador Sarna. Thanks,
Thank you, everybody. Congratulations, Zeeshan.
I would now
Thank you
request,
so much, Ambassador.
I would now request Srishti to do the honors to thanks everyone who took out time to be on this panel, and especially the audience who took out time on a working day. Srishti, please.
You're on mute.
So you can say, no, you're still on mute. Seems to be some technical snag. Is it okay now? No. So we can feel it that you're saying a large, big thanks to everyone. Thanks a lot, Maya, for all the efforts, for putting it so well, stitching it so well. And thank you, Srishti, for being there and sending your wishes to us as silently as possible.
All the very best, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.